this is actually a very tricky move, because the idea is that if we grab this pawn, because we might be tempted looking, hey, it's a free pawn and we're going to get a new queen on the next move. But that would be a huge mistake. Hey guys, this is Andy from Noctie, and today we're gonna go through the weekly scenario for week 29 of 2025. Alright, so let's take a look at this week's position. So this week we have a very interesting queenless middle game, or perhaps some would call it an endgame because the queens are off the board. But generally speaking, when the queens are off the board and there are still many pieces left, it's usually called a queenless middle game. So in this case, the material is equal. Both sides have both of the rooks left and also 2 minor pieces each. If you count the pawns, we see that both sides has 6 pawns. White has 2 on the queen side and 4 on the king side, whilst black has 3 on the queen side and 3 on the king side. So already here with the pawn structure, we see that there is an imbalance. So each side have their own pawn majority. Black has a pawn majority on the queen side and white has one on the king side. And this is very important because the pawns are usually the guiding light when we develop strategic plans. And there's this famous chess quote often attributed to the French chess master Philidor, saying that the pawns are the soul of chess. Although quite abstract, we can still derive a very interesting principle from that, and that is that the pawn structures guide the strategic ideas, and often we want to look for pawn pushes or pawn breaks. So what is a pawn break? Well, a pawn break is a move where you move your pawn and it creates contact with the opponent's pawns. So in this case, white has one and actually only one pawn break possible, and that is to play a4, creating this contact with the pawn here on b5. So yeah, we'll come back to this a little bit later when we discuss concrete ideas for white, but that is very important to keep in mind. Alright, so the pawn structure is the first imbalance of the position. And the second one is that white has a bishop here on e3 in return for a knight for black. So generally speaking, when we have rook endgames, bishops are usually stronger because a rook and a bishop work very well together. They are both long-range pieces and can work together to target weak pawns and also play on both sides of the board. Whilst on the other hand, a queen and a knight are usually a very good attacking combination. So in this case, with the rooks on the board and the queens are off, white has also a slight advantage thanks to having the bishop. And in addition, this bishop here on e3 is also a very strong piece because it eyes this important diagonal from g1 to a7. Alright, so with regards to these two aspects, white has quite a significant positional advantage, even though the material balance is equal. Now let's look for some concrete ideas for white. So when we look at this, the first thing that we see is that there is one open file, and that is the d file. That is the only open file of the position. So here white can play, for example, rook d1 or rook d2, both challenging the d file. But one issue here is that black can do the same, putting their rooks on d8. And what will happen here is that most probably the rooks will be changed off. And then nothing really happens. So although a valid idea and a logical one, in this case it misses a bit of white's potential. So instead we should turn our attention to the queen side, and as we discussed, look for this a4 pawn break. So pawn breaks are very important. As we said, it creates contact with the opponent's pawns and can potentially change the pawn structures. And the pawn structure in turn often are the guiding lights when we develop strategic ideas. So here, when we push a4, the idea is that if black captures, then we'll take back with the rook, of course, and that will leave black with 2 weak pawns here on a6 and c4. and those can easily be attacked, and white will most probably win them both. So when we play a4, black has two choices, either to leave the position as it is, maintaining the tension, or push b4. So let's look at b4 here. So when we play a4, we must always calculate what happens if black pushes b4. So if black plays b4, then we'll have to capture, because otherwise b3 will be quite dangerous, creating a protected passed pawn. So let's see here. a4, black plays b4, we take with the c pawn, and black takes back with the knight. So although the result is the same, black now has these two weak pawns here on c4 and a6, but the difference here is that black has a tempo, because when he takes back with the knight, they are attacking our rook here on a2, so we are forced to move it, and in that time black can prepare to support the pawn here on the c4 square. So as we saw, a4 is no good because black have the b4 pawn push. So how can we prepare a4? So that is the idea that we should be preparing and looking for. Here, white has a very logical move that prepares a4 and stops black from playing b4 when we make the pawn break. So that is the move rook b1. So what happens here is that we control the b4 square. So when we play a4, b4 is impossible because now we have the rook here on b1, where we can just grab the pawn for free. And in addition, when we play rook b1, we also add pressure on the b5 square. So when we play a4, we are also threatening to take and win the pawn on b4. So that is why it's the most straightforward idea. And yeah, now it's our turn to play against Noctie. Let's see if we manage to win this. Alright, now it's our turn to play against Noctie. And here, the difficulty that I'm playing against is rook 2, which is approximately a 1900 online rating level. And this scenario is set to play at the same rank as you are in. So since I'm at rook 2, Noctie will be playing as rook 2 as default. So yeah, our mission here is to play for win and hopefully win this. Let's see if we can do that. So as we discussed, I'm gonna play rook b1 with the idea of preparing the a4 pawn push. Okay, interesting. Black plays knight d7, a very logical move. So one rule of thumb when you are looking for ideas is to look at your pieces and then try to identify the worst piece or the piece that is far from action and try to improve it. So here black realizes that the play is going to be focused on the queen side. So with that said, it's going to be very logical to bring the f6 knight over. And with this move, black also controls now the c5 and b6 dark squares that our bishop otherwise would have access to. Alright, but this doesn't stop our plan from playing a4, this important pawn break that we discussed, so I'm going to go ahead and do just that. Nice, we got a blue move. So quick reminder, blue move is a great move, so very happy that Noctie agrees with our idea. Let's see here, black plays rook f to b8, defending the b5 pawn. But here we actually have a tactical sequence that wins us a pawn. So when we play a takes b5, here black must take with the a pawn, because taking with the rook would be a huge blunder, because we can simply grab back and the a6 pawn here is pinned because the a8 rook is undefended. So here when we play a takes b5, black will have to take back with the a pawn, and now we can play this important intermediate move, or intermezzo, or in German it's a Zwischenzug, that is to play rook takes a8, and when black takes back, that will leave the b5 pawn unprotected, so we'll win the b5 pawn in the end. Alright, so we go ahead and grab the b5 pawn. Black will have to take back with the a pawn. Here Noctie thinks for a few seconds to see if there are some tricks, but I don't think black will be able to find any trick here. Nope, so Noctie takes back with the a pawn, and now we just take the rook here on a8. black takes back, of course, and that will leave the b5 pawn hanging in the end. And just to double check that we don't miss any back rank ideas, if we take back, if black gives a check here, then we always have the f2 square for the king. So now we grab the b5 pawn and let's see what Noctie does. Alright, so Noctie goes to e5 with the knight, a very logical move, with the idea of infiltrating and going to this important d3 outpost. And this d3 outpost is a very strong square for black because it is a light square and our bishop is on a dark square. So here it's very important that we use the other pieces and try to protect the square. So yeah, one idea here is to play knight f4, protecting this square, but here black would have the g5 pawn push. I'm not sure if it's sound, because if black plays g5 they are exposing their king, but on the other hand it is a bit annoying because then we have to move the knight. So here I'm instead anticipating this knight d3 infiltration, because then that will actually threaten a back rank mate here with the rook and knight together. So I'm gonna actually just play h4. I think that is good because it gives some air for our king. We can run up here on h2 if that is required. And also we are actually stopping the g5 pawn push for black. So I think this is a good idea. Nice, we got a purple move, or perhaps a pink move, some would say. So that is an excellent move. That is a good move. That is quite hard to find. Alright, black plays f6. Let's see what happens here. And yeah, it looks like black is preparing g5, adding more support to the g5 square, and the knight here on e5. What do we do? Can we play knight f4 now? Let's see. Okay, if we play knight f4, and if black goes g5, we take, then it feels like black is weakening their king side so much. Yeah, let's go with that. Nice, another purple move. That is really good to see. Or is it a pink move? I don't know. For me, I see it as a purple move. So yeah, please comment down below. Is it a pink move or purple move? Alright, Noctie gives a check here on a1. Here we have a choice either to go to f2 or to h2. I think I'm going to go to h2 because f2 is potentially being exposed to this knight check here on d3. So let's go with king h2. Alright, it's a good move. So it's a green move. That is nice to see. Let's see what Noctie comes up with here. Alright, rook a2. This is a tricky move because here they are pinning our g-pawn. So here Noctie is actually threatening to take the f3 pawn. So here we have to be a bit cautious not to fall into any traps. But I think we can just go king g3. Nice. A blue move. That is good to see. Alright, Noctie goes for our c3 pawn. And here I think it's a bit hard to defend it. Or yeah, we have this knight d5 move protecting the pawn. But then that will leave the d3 square exposed. Black could jump in there if they want. But on the other hand, it should be quite safe, right? And the other choice is to play bishop d4. And if we play bishop d4, we have to always calculate knight takes. And if knight takes, then we have pawn takes. And yeah, I think that is good. Yeah, I'm gonna go with bishop d4, protecting the pawn with the bishop. Let's see what Noctie does. Alright, Noctie goes knight d3. Interesting. So here, let's see what happens. Noctie, of course, can take the knight here. So if we don't do anything, Noctie can take our knight, and then if we take back with the king, they have rook takes g2. But on the other hand, after that, we have rook c5. winning the c4 pawn. So perhaps we don't have to be afraid of knight takes f4. And of course, if we take the knight, then black will take with the c pawn, and this passed d pawn will be quite dangerous. Okay, let's see. And if we don't do anything, that is a good tip actually. So if we're unsure what to play, stop for a moment and see if it's your opponent's turn to play again, what would they do? And then we can try to stop that. So it's a good way for preventing their ideas. So here, if it's black to move, they can also play knight e1, potentially adding some pressure here. But I don't think any of these threats from black is too dangerous. I think we can just now go ahead and find a proactive idea for white. And one idea that I like is to keep pushing the h-pawn. So often here it's good to grab more space and push down a pawn here to try to disrupt black's king side. So here when we play h5, we're also threatening h6 because our bishop here is putting pressure on these pawns. So let's go with that. Nice. I think that is a third excellent move for today. So that is great to see. I feel like we are in a flow right now. So let's see if we can keep this up. All right. So here we don't have much choice. Yeah, we have to take back the knight. Now the g-pawn is hanging, but we had anticipated this and we had the idea of going for the c-pawn if black takes our g-pawn. So yeah, let's see what happens. Okay, instead black grabs our bishop with this in-between move. Yeah, once again we have to take back. Let's do that. And now we have transformed into a rook endgame. So we have one pawn extra in this rook endgame, or I would say like temporarily upper pawn. And rook endgames is arguably the most difficult endgames in chess. For one part is because they are so varied. There are so many different setups that can appear. And also that is both very hard to defend and very difficult to convert. So black attacks our d4 pawn, but here I think we can just play d5, pushing forwards. So I don't think that was the best defense from black's side, because we want to push this past d pawn anyways. And here we put the rook here on c5. So we are eyeing the c2 pawn, and here it's very important that we have the rook behind the pawn. So here a quick tip in rook endgames, both when you're defending and when you're attacking, we want to have the rook behind the passed pawn. So here when we are defending against this passed pawn, having the rook behind it will stop it pushing forwards. And here when black has their rook adjacent to it, they can't leave the second rank because that would leave the c2 pawn unprotected. But here we have to protect our g-pawn, so I think just go with g4. 2 squares forwards, also protecting the h-pawn. And yeah, here I think giving a check is a good idea because this pawn is guarding this square, and this forces black to go to the 8th rank. Okay, let's see here. Of course, we cannot grab the g7 pawn because then black would get a new queen. Let's see what ideas we can come up with. So one idea is to moving forwards with the king. So going king f5, and then with the idea of going f4, push forwards, create our own passed pawn, and holding our rook here on the c file, stopping black from promoting. And the other idea is to go with the king to e3, and then when black moves the rook, so let's say here king e3, black has two moves, either to g2 or to h2, because they want to protect the c pawn. Then on the next move we can go to d3 and grab the c2 pawn. Both of these ideas I think are valid, and here is the difficulty in rook endgame. So we have these two opposing ideas and we have to choose. And choosing wrong can mean that we blow our winning chance. But here I think I like going forwards more and creating our own passed pawn. So let's see. Okay, nice. It's a green move. Here I'm really happy that it's not a blunder. Here black goes and attacks our rook. We can simply bring it back to c6. And from there it is protected. So now we can continue with the idea of pushing our pawns and create another passed pawn. Let's see what happens here. Okay, here we have two moves, I think, that are good. Either h6, so this pawn break, another pawn break, we are creating contact with black's pawn. And here the idea is that if black takes or if black pushes forwards, we can grab the pawn here, f6. But then after that, black can play rook f2, we move, they take our f3 pawn, we take the c2 pawn. I think that works. So yeah, let's go with that. Nice, a blue move. So here we see the power of pawn breaks, creating contact and forcing black to give a concession on their pawn structure. Let's see what happens. Noctie is thinking. This is a tough position, and I think black is realizing that it is lost. So yeah, Noctie here is instead trying to be as tricky as possible. Here, okay. Oh, this is actually a very tricky move, because the idea is that if we grab this pawn, because we might be tempted looking, hey, it's a free pawn and we're gonna get a new queen on the next move. But that would be a huge mistake. Pause for a second to see if you can find why. So we can't grab the g7 pawn, right? Because then black would play rook f3, taking our pawn and giving this beautiful checkmate, because they are checking our king. This pawn is blocking these two squares, and these two squares are also blocked. So that was a really tricky move from Noctie, and here's a very good example of how tricky Noctie can be. So even if you're ahead, we cannot relax, because Noctie will try to trick you. And here, if we would have taken the g7 pawn, then we would have been very upset. I think pushing forwards is correct, because now we are stopping that idea, and we want to push forwards anyways to create passed pawns. Let's see what Noctie does. Okay, Noctie gives a check, and here we don't have much choice, we simply grab this pawn. Okay, Noctie goes there, and here I think I'm gonna go for the h7 pawn, because then we'll have a very dangerous passed pawn on h6. Let's go with that. What will Noctie do? So here I think I'm not gonna even bother taking the c2 pawn, because the c2 pawn is not going anywhere anyways. Instead I'm gonna grab the h7 pawn to create this dangerous passed pawn on h6. Let's see what Noctie does. Okay, logical, Noctie grabs a g-pawn, but now we move away with our king, and in the next few moves we're gonna march down the h-pawn. Yeah, I think here we can relax a bit. We have this very nice position. We're gonna get ourselves a new queen. Black will be forced to sacrifice their rook, and then we can just sweep the board with our rook and win the game. So here we just have to be a bit careful. I'm just gonna take the c2 pawn and then take the g pawn, and then we'll have a checkmate with rook and king. And here there will be a checkmate very soon. We go king b3, they go king b1, that is the only move, And here, when we have the king opposite to each other, we have opposition controlling these 3 squares. Now we bring down our rook to h1, giving checkmate because we have a check here and our king is controlling these 3 squares. Alright, so we managed to do it, and yeah, I'm really happy that we did this. So just a quick reminder, you can always choose to replay this now that you've completed it at the normal level, and then just increase the difficulty. And this position is a very good one for doing that because it's quite equal. So here it can make quite a big difference depending on the quality of black's defense. So here, for example, I was playing at rook 2. I could perhaps go to rook 3 or even rook 4 and play this again and see if I can convert this. Alright, so that was this week's scenario, a very interesting queenless middle game. And as we saw, the central idea for this position was to play for the a4 pawn break. And as we discussed, pawn breaks are very important, and when we are planning strategic ideas, the first thing that we should look for is pawn breaks, because the pawn structure and in turn pawn breaks often guides where our pieces should be going and which squares that we should be focusing on. And yeah, in this case we managed to do that and then convert a winning rook endgame. If you feel like you want to refresh any of the rook endgame ideas, for example how to checkmate with a rook and a king, or fundamental rook endgame positions, then we do have lessons for that in Noctie. So feel free to check that out. I'll put the link down in the description. Alright, thank you so much for watching, and as always, happy playing. Bye bye!